Welcome to another episode of Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. This is my number 47 today in midsummer of 2022. Now, you might first of all ask yourself, why does Harry contribute those YouTube episodes? Why, for that matter, does he also record once monthly with James Abbott Middle East Analysis? Well, the answer is very simple as far as I'm concerned. My pods and my video clips aren't a rehash of news. You have so many sources in order to get the news that you seek. So there's no point in me once in a while popping on your screen and telling you this, that, or the other. What these pods and video clips do are basically that they are reflections on events that are taking place in the MENA and Gulf regions, particularly, but also sometimes on Armenian issues and even those affecting us in the UK that are personal to me. The reflections are personal. And in other words, what I mean by that is that they aren't institutional. Now, I watch so many video clips. I participate, sometimes actively, sometimes passively, in conferences. I listen to many pods, and most of them reflect willy-nilly not only the author's viewpoints, but also those of their institutions. And this isn't a criticism. If I'm working for an institution, I can't say something that is at loggerheads, that goes contrary to what the institution that is paying my salary is advocating. But in my case, thankfully, I would say, and also sorrowfully in some instances where life tends to get more complicated and more difficult, I'm not shackled. I'm not bound by such constraints. I can freely say what I think. This is what I do with Middle East Analysis with James Abbott, and he encourages me and allows me to say that in some 45 odd minutes, or on those YouTube clips and episodes in some 15 or so minutes too. Okay, that was my preamble, the introduction to explain why I share those with you, those YouTubes with you. Now, last night, I was having dinner with a friend who also happens to be an associate of sorts. We work together, but I will not go any further into that. We were sitting in an Iranian restaurant, and yes, Iranian restaurants are not bound by sanctions from the West. We were having a meal in an Iranian restaurant, and then this friend suddenly asked me quite directly, Harry, in a previous YouTube episode, you said that you're reserving judgment about what is happening in Tunisia. You didn't want to call it a coup d'etat. You didn't want to say, oh, it's nothing. Has your opinion changed? It was a good question. And yes, I remember that clip quite clearly in my own mind. I had reserved initial judgment because I was actually unsure where President Qais Said was taking the country, Tunisia. Tunisia, that had initiated the so-called Arab Spring, what we now call revolutionary uprisings, in 2010, 2011. And it was the only North African Arab country that could claim to a level of democracy through its institutions and its powers. But look at Tunisia today. They've just had a referendum. The background picture shows it, 25th of July, only 2 days ago. They had a referendum in which there was an approval. Government mouthpieces say that it was a huge approval. Well, if you consider that the 30% of the population of those allowed to vote only voted, a majority of 30% is not the whole country. But let me not go into these little nitpicking details. And let me say that there was a majority to approve this new constitution that replaces the one of 2014 following the so-called Arab Spring. But look at that constitution, read it. Forget the 46 or so errors that have been pointed out in the constitution. Look at what it does in terms of human rights. Look at what it does in terms of separation of powers, the separation of the executive from the legislative, from the judiciary. In other words, government from parliament, from courts. Look at the fact that this new constitution, which has just been approved, as I said, doesn't talk of powers, executive, legislative, judiciary. What it says is jobs. These are jobs, and for me, these aren't jobs. When I was doing my law degree and I was studying constitutional law, we were very big on these three powers and the separation between these three powers. This separation which prevents an abuse of power. Look at what happened with the Trump presidency in the United States. Look at what is happening in many other European countries, whether those 27 within the EU or outside it. And outside it, look at what happens sometimes in our own country, that Rolls-Royce, as it was known in the past, not only of the legal system, but also of democracy. The existence of a clear separation of three powers and the existence of institutions is what guarantees that abuse of power cannot take place. And if it takes place, it can be stopped and it can be dealt with. Remove those separations, remove those institutions, make the country, as Tunisia, in my opinion, is becoming these days, a monocracy, one man at the top of the pyramid, and everybody basically kowtows to him. That is not a democracy, no matter how it's embellished and no matter how it is sold to the population. And yes, those Tunisians you see, the young people who were demonstrating in the streets and voicing their support for the new constitution and for President Qais Said's reforms, those people who are doing all this, fine. I understand their angst. I understand their problems. And what are those problems? There was corruption. There was abuse of power. There was a sense of Islamism that was political and probably was frustrating a lot of the people there. There were lots of these things, but to try and remedy this, and guess who's doing the remedy? A law professor himself, the president. To remedy this by basically sweeping away all those powers, calling them jobs, and deciding that he and he alone is the reference point, this is like joining a feudal club again. And for a country like Tunisia, that is a shame. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. As I said in my preamble, in my introduction, these are my own non-institutional personal reflections. Agree with them, disagree with them, but as Voltaire said, I might disagree with you, but I will die defending your right to express your opinions. So let me sort of catapult quickly from Tunisia to Iraq. Iraq, that had an election, legislative or parliamentary elections, 9-10 months ago. Yet no government. They're still fighting amongst themselves. Who's going to be prime minister? Which party is going to have the upper hand? And recently, you might have heard in the news that Muhammad al-Sudani has been proposed by some of the Shia parties as the new prime minister to replace Mustafa al-Kadhimi, and that parliament has to approve it. Will parliament approve it? And there is a whole sequence of events. It's not only a man in the name of the prime minister, and it is a man, who will be there. It's also what will happen to the incumbent president. Will he stay on, or will he be replaced too? After all, the presidency is a decision made largely by the two main Kurdish parties in the north of Iraq. And they are bickering amongst themselves. One wants to keep the incumbent president, Barham Saleh. The other one wants to bring another person in. And of course, in all of this, you have the sort of unpredictable agent, the floating atom, Muqtada Sadr, who basically mobilizes a movement called Sairun, En Marche. Reminds me of what Macron did in France with his political party. He is also there upsetting the apple cart, wanting to do things his way, not getting away with it, and therefore this stasis, this sense of things aren't working, things aren't coming together. Now, yes, I know people would say this is to do with Iran. Iran is meddling in Iraq. Iran has a huge influence in Iraq, but so does, perhaps less so, but so does the United States. And it is a bit a tug of war between those two powers. But it is also, in my opinion, humbly, a domestic issue. Much as we can always blame the other, the neighbor, the foreigner, the outsider, the outlier, yes, but it's also a domestic issue. It's an issue to do with all Iraqis. Iraq has been in an absolute state of uncertainty since Saddam Hussein was taken away and since the Americans completely messed up the institutions of the country, institutions again, and we now have this uncertainty. Who is the top dog in Iraq? This is what the fight is all about, because Iraq is a big country. It's a very important country. It's a country that has a huge civilization going all the way to the Abbasid dynasty, which is close enough to the Prophet Muhammad. It is also a country gurgling with oil, but it is a country so rife with confessionalism, with sectarianism, with tribalism, with everybody wanting to get a piece of the action, to sort of wrench out a bit an advantage, an asset, that the country is where it is today. And given its geostrategic place in the region, next to Syria, next to Turkey, itself divided between the Kurds, the Shia, the lesser constituency, the Sunnis, and also the minorities, it is dangerous. So that's my second thought today for you, food for thought. Think about it. If you're interested in the region, think about what I'm saying, consider it, and then either build on it or trash it. And I will conclude today's episode of YouTube with a very simple reminder that Shereen Abu Aqleh, the Al Jazeera news journalist who was murdered in Jenin outside the refugee camp, her case has not been properly examined yet, despite everybody from Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International to all the human rights organizations and some others as well, saying we should have an impartial investigation. It hasn't happened yet. But the family is not allowing her case to be forgotten. And the latest development is that Shereen Abu Aqleh's family, her brother Anton, her niece, nephew, and family are in the United States, where they have met with the Secretary of State Tony Blinken, where they have also been meeting congressmen and congresswomen, where they're having press conferences, reminding the world that here is a woman, Palestinian and also American, an icon in terms of news making and news presenting, who was murdered in cold blood. And neither the United States, nor Israel, nor the ICC in The Hague, nor for that matter, the Palestinian Authority, are exerting every effort to push forward her file so that there is an investigation and a clear cut, not sort of slanting from one side of your mouth, but a clear cut statement about her murder, how did it happen, and who committed it. Because if we continue like this, I can only come to one very, very sad conclusion. The conclusion is that the fate of Shereen Abu Aqleh's murder is following the same script and the same pattern as that of Jamal Khashoggi. A lot of lively discussion, outrage and frustration. In Jamal Khashoggi's case, a few human rights organizations and his fiancée. In Shereen Abu Aqleh's case, many more people. That it's going in the same direction of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. We talk about it, and then gradually we start forgetting about it, and then we slowly but surely sweep it under the carpet. Well, the Abu Aqleh family are doing their best to disallow that to happen to their sister, to their aunt, and I wish them the best. Just as I wish you all the best in this midsummer episode. Take care, and until the next time.